Good evening, community. Today I want to tell you about what that happened to me many years ago in December of 1994, when I was working away from my hometown. My name is Emilio, and that night I realized that there are things we cannot understand, yet they undoubtedly exist. Very dark and diabolical things. What I experienced that time left a permanent mark on me, and I want to share it with you exactly as it happened. Well, to start, I want you to know that I am a calm person, somewhat serious. I have never been the type to go out to parties or big gatherings. If possible, I prefer staying home and resting. At that time, my job involved traveling, and I had to move from town to town, so I was used to arriving in new places, renting a cheap room, and going about my business. It was during one of those trips that my traumatic event occurred. It was December of 1994, the season of Posadas, traditional Christmas gatherings, and I arrived in a small town for work. The place was nice, a typical provincial setting with cobblestone streets and old houses. I managed to rent a room in a somewhat old but quiet housing complex. The landlord, a very friendly man, told me that people in town were organizing posadas every night, and that very day there was going to be a big celebration at a house a few blocks away. He invited me, but I was exhausted from the trip. I just wanted to take a bath and go to sleep early. That night, the housing complex was left empty because all the neighbors went to the posada. As soon as night fell, the place became completely dark and silent, except for the distant sounds of Christmas festivities. I thought it was the perfect setting to relax and try to sleep early. It was only sunset when I settled in. The room was simple: a bed, a small table, a sink, and not much else. I put my things down, relaxed for a bit, and then decided to take a quick shower to wash away the fatigue from traveling. But that was when everything began. I heard far off the typical songs from a posada. At first, I paid no attention because I thought it was just noise coming from a nearby street. But as the minutes passed, those songs seemed to get closer and closer, as if people were walking straight toward the housing complex. It struck me as odd because, according to the landlord, the celebration was several blocks away. When I came out of the bathroom just wearing a towel around my waist, I realized that the singing was practically inside the housing complex. It was very clear, as if a large group was right there in the central courtyard. I decided to ignore it and put on my clothes, but just when I was about to lie down, I noticed that the singing was getting even closer. It was no longer the typical litany to ask for posada. It was slower, and worst of all, it began to sound right outside my door. They started knocking, as if they were asking for shelter, but at my room. I froze and did not dare open the door. I just lay on the bed and tried to make as little noise as possible, hoping they would think no one was inside. I did not know what to do. I thought, what if it is someone from town who just got the wrong place? But something inside me told me that was not it. The singing continued, and the knocking on the door became more insistent. That was when I realized something was very wrong. The singing no longer sounded normal. The voices changed. They sounded deeper, as if different people were singing. The words were strange, unintelligible, and the worst part was that, in the midst of the singing, I began to hear laughter. Horrible, mocking laughter, mixed with a wailing that sounded heartbreaking. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The knocking on the door grew stronger, as though something very insistent wanted to get in. I sat in the corner of the room, hugging my knees, completely terrified. The knocking persisted, and the laughter was mixed with screams. And that singing I could not understand, but that sounded so dark, as if it were invoking something. I felt like I could not breathe, like there was a heavy weight on my chest. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. And suddenly, everything stopped. Just like that, from one second to another. No more knocking, no more laughter, no more screaming. Only the humming of the night remained, that silence that makes your ears ring, and some distant noise from the posadas. I stayed still for a few minutes, trembling, until I finally mustered the courage to crawl to the window that looked out onto the courtyard. I moved closer very slowly and peeked through a small gap. And what I saw, I will never forget. What I saw left a permanent mark on me. At the far end of the courtyard in the darkness, there were 7 figures. They were tall, thin, completely black, like human shadows but much longer. They did not move and seemed to emanate some kind of dark smoke that floated around them. I realized that these figures, though I could not distinguish any details, were facing me, watching me directly. I felt a gaze so intense that I had never experienced anything like it before, something that went right through me. The fear overcame me so profoundly that I felt an enormous weight on my chest, almost as if I could not breathe. It was so overwhelming that, without even noticing, I ended up fainting. I woke up the next day to more knocking on the door, but this time it was the landlord. He was shouting, asking if I was all right because he was worried I had not come out all day. I opened the door, still groggy, unsure of what had happened, and with some hesitation I told him what I had experienced. He listened, but in the end, he did not seem to take me very seriously. He said it was probably just a nightmare or the exhaustion from traveling. But it was not that. I know what I saw. While we were talking, a neighbor overheard our conversation. She was an older lady named Martha, very religious, the kind of person who was always praying. She asked me to tell her what had happened, and although I hesitated, I described everything to her. The singing, the knocking, the figures. I was sitting at the small table in my room, my hands trembling as I held a cup of coffee that I had not even heated. Despite being surrounded by those simple walls, I felt that the air was still charged with something I could not understand. Doña Martha, I swear it was not my imagination. There were 7 black figures. They had no faces, but I could feel them looking right at me. They did not speak, but I heard something like a whisper, a buzzing sound that filled the whole room. And the cold, it was like hell itself had come in with me. Never in my life have I felt that kind of fear. Doña Martha, a devout woman of unshakable faith, made the sign of the cross upon hearing my words. Her hands began to tremble slightly, but her voice came out steady and filled with concern. Listen to me carefully, Emilio. What you are telling me is not just anything. This is something serious. Very serious. She paused as if gathering strength for what she was about to say. 7 figures. That is not just any number. In the Bible, the number 7 represents fullness, completeness. But also, Emilio, when it comes to what is evil, it can represent the totality of wickedness. Do you remember what happened to Mary Magdalene? She was tormented by 7 demons, Emilio. 7. Those figures you saw, they could be a sign, a warning that something very dark is around you. Martha's words hit me like a bucket of cold water. The silence became thick as though the room had closed in on me even more. With a lump in my throat, I asked her, "A sign, you say? And what do they want from me?" She looked at me with a mix of compassion and something that looked like fear, something I did not expect to see in a woman like her. That, Emilio, only God knows, but we cannot ignore it. If they were demons, it means they are after something. They do not appear for no reason. They could be trying to enter your life, to take control. Sometimes these things come where there is something for them to feed on. Unconfessed sins, grudges, bad influences, or even when someone is too weak, lacking spiritual protection. She leaned in a bit closer, her eyes shining with conviction. Listen carefully. This was not a simple nightmare. You need to protect yourself. Those dark figures do not come alone. Often they are sent by something greater, something that wants to destroy us from the inside. You must pray, repent, and ask for forgiveness if you have done anything to attract them, and you must ask for divine help. I would recommend visiting the priest tomorrow and getting yourself blessed. I swallowed hard, feeling my voice tremble as I asked her, "Do you think I did something to make them appear?" She shook her head, but her expression remained serious. "I do not know, Emilio, but they always look for a way in. I will tell you something from the Bible. In Matthew 12:43-45, it says that when an unclean spirit leaves a person, It returns with 7 others worse than itself if it finds the house empty. Do you know what that means? That if your soul is unprotected, they can come back. You must make sure your house, your heart, your mind, your life is filled with God. Doña Martha stood up and placed her hand on my shoulder. I am going to pray with you tonight, but this cannot end here. Do not take these things lightly. What you saw was not from this world. As she began to pray, each word filled with a faith you could truly feel. I stayed there, trying to process everything. The fear was still there, but it was different now, deeper, heavier, because I could not get what she had said out of my head. Those shadows that visited me were not just spirits. They were something darker and more diabolical, something that, perhaps, had not finished with me yet. Doña Martha prayed with me for quite a while that night. Her voice trembled a bit, but it remained strong and determined. I still felt a huge weight on my chest, as though something dark was still lingering, but her prayers gave me some relief. Before leaving, she held my hands and said, "Do not let fear paralyze you. Tomorrow, talk to the priest right away, do not put it off, and when you go back home, take the blessing with you." I hardly slept that night, but the next day, very early, I went to look for the priest. I arrived at the town's church with a lump in my throat, almost not knowing how to explain what had happened. Luckily, the priest was a kind man, not the type to judge or make fun of you. He listened intently, without interrupting, as I told him everything: the singing, the knocking, the figures in the courtyard. When I finished, he looked at me solemnly and said, "What you experienced is not common. But remember, Emilio, evil can only enter if we allow it. You did the right thing by seeking help." The priest took me to a corner of the church where he had holy water. First, he prayed with me, asking God to protect me and to drive away whatever might be hovering around me. Then, he blessed a small crucifix and gave it to me, saying, "Carry it with you always. Let it be your shield against any shadow." Finally, he offered to go to the room I was renting to bless it as well. I agreed without hesitation. We returned to the housing complex, and although it was daytime, the place still felt strange. The priest blessed every corner of the room with holy water and prayers. While he did this, I could not stop looking at the window that faced the courtyard. In my mind, those black figures still stood there, as if they were watching me. But this time, with the priest present, I felt a bit of hope. Before leaving, he looked at me seriously and said, "Do not let fear drive you away from the light. Go back home, Emilio. Rest, and do not forget to pray." That same afternoon, I gathered my things, paid for the room, and left town. On the way back, my mind was filled with thoughts, but above all, there was one question I could not stop asking. Why me? I do not know if I will ever have an answer. All I know is that this experience changed me forever. Ever since then, I do not stay alone in any unfamiliar place, and I always carry with me the crucifix the priest gave me. Today, in my own home, whenever December approaches, I cannot help but remember that night. I pray more intensely, hoping that diabolical visit never comes back, and I am grateful to be alive to tell this story. Has it ever happened to you that something so normal and routine ends up being something you can't forget? Well, that's exactly what happened to me at one of my town's Posadas, those festive gatherings everyone looks forward to with excitement, where nothing out of the ordinary ever seems to happen. But that night was different. Something strange occurred, something I still don't fully understand. Yet sometimes, when I walk through those same streets, it comes to mind and makes me look back just in case. My name is Raul, and this took place in December of 2017, during the third Posada in my town. It was a cold night, but it didn't matter because the warmth of the candles and everyone's high spirits always made the occasion special. We gathered as usual in the main square where the procession is held. The cobblestone streets and the houses decorated with lights and little lanterns made everything look magical, like something out of a postcard. There were about 30 of us in total, children, teenagers, and adults. I was there with my sister and my cousins, ready to sing and have a good time. We started walking with our candles lit, singing En el nombre del cielo. The children ran ahead, the adults made sure nobody tripped, and everything seemed normal, at least at first. After we'd gone past the first street, something odd began to creep in. Someone said they could hear a strange echo of our footsteps, like somebody else was trailing behind the group. We thought it might be someone who arrived late, but when we turned around, we saw no one. We were all there, so we brushed it off and kept going. However, that echo, or what sounded like extra footsteps, didn't disappear. They were different from ours, heavier, as if they belonged to a very large person stomping with force. Whenever we stopped to sing in front of a house, those footsteps also stopped. And when we started walking again, there they were once more, following us. At first, nobody said anything, but you could sense the unease growing within the group. Some of the children even began holding their parents' hands as if they too felt that heavy vibe settling around us. At one point, we decided to stop all at once so we could listen carefully. That was when we confirmed what we feared. Those footsteps weren't coming from any of us, because we heard them continue on for a couple more steps after everyone else had already stopped. It was a firm, dull sound, like someone treading hard on the cobblestones. Some people turned around to look, but there was nobody there, just an empty street. We went on with the procession, but the atmosphere had changed. People kept singing, but more quietly, as if they didn't want to draw attention. While we walked, our candles began to flicker, as though an invisible gust of wind was trying to blow them out. There was no wind at all, I remember that clearly, but the flames seemed to go out on their own, then reignite. When we reached the second-to-last house where the cobblestone ended and a dirt road began, an older woman, Doña Rosa, said something that froze us in place. She pointed at the ground and said, "Look at the footprints." We all turned, and what we saw left us speechless. In the damp earth right beside our normal footprints, there were other marks. They weren't from shoes or bare feet. They looked like claw prints, long and deep, as if something had been walking among us. Someone tried to explain it away by saying maybe it was a dog, but that was impossible. These prints were far too large, and they were aligned as though they belonged to something walking upright. The tension and the heavy feeling in the air got even darker. A few people suggested we turn back, but others insisted we had to finish the procession. So we continued, though with more fear than eagerness. The clawed footprints stayed with us, becoming clearer the farther we went, and now they seemed to echo louder, wilder, as if something didn't appreciate us noticing them. Eventually, we arrived at the last house where we always conclude the procession with final prayers before heading to the church. But when we got there, nobody wanted to go inside. The footprints weren't just on the path anymore. They were in the house's yard, leading right up to the front door. We decided to stay outside and pray there, keeping our candles lit, hoping it would give us at least a bit of security. While we prayed, someone realized the prints continued beyond that point, heading toward the town church. The priest who was with us told everyone to remain calm and asked us to accompany him to the church so he could bless it, just in case. Even though we didn't really want to, we all went together. Once we arrived, the footprints ended directly at the church doors as if something had been waiting right there. The priest carefully opened the doors, and everything inside looked normal. Still, he chose to bless the place and lead us in one more prayer. That night, no one said much about what had happened, but we all remembered it. The next day, people in town began saying they'd heard footsteps outside their homes during the early morning hours, like something was roaming the streets. After everything we saw and heard that night, there aren't many logical explanations. The footprints, the sounds of those steps, the oppressive feeling. Most of our neighbors came to the same conclusion. That night, the devil was in our town. It walked among us along our cobblestone streets and between our candlelights, as though it was watching, waiting for something. Even now, that idea still sends shivers down my spine because when you realize we weren't alone, you understand that what was with us wasn't anything good. Hello everyone. My name is Tonio and I am 28 years old. I live in a typical neighborhood in Mexico, the kind where the Posadas in December are the most anticipated tradition. Here, we all know each other, and every family contributes something. Some bring the ponche, others bring the tamales, and of course the piñata is a must. What I'm going to tell you happened a couple of years ago at one of those posadas, and to be honest, I am still surprised by what took place. It was something that seemed like a simple party, just like every year, but it ended up being a night that nobody has been able to forget. That day was our 7th posada in the neighborhood. As always, we gathered at the Ramirez family's house because they have a large patio where we can all fit. We arrived early to decorate with lights, the typical Christmas light strings, the nativity scene, and we hung the star-shaped piñata in the center of the patio. It was a traditional piñata, one of those large ones with bright colors, and we filled it with candy, peanuts, oranges, and some little bags with small toys. Everything seemed perfect for a wonderful evening. You know how a posada goes. First there are prayers, then the walk asking for lodging, pidiendo posada, with lit candles, and finally, everyone gathers to enjoy food and music. The piñata is always the most anticipated moment, especially for the children. So after singing Christmas carols, villancicos, and handing out cups of ponche, the time came to break the piñata. We were all gathered around it, laughing and cheering on the kids. There was a huge line because, everybody wants a turn to break it. While an adult held the rope to move it around, the kids took turns with the stick, hitting it as hard as they could, although at first they could not break it. It was all laughter and shouts of, "Hit it harder, harder," as the children tried to strike it while blindfolded. After several turns, the piñata was already in rough shape, with the points hanging and the paper torn. That was when the oldest kid, who was about 10 years old, delivered the final blow. The piñata broke, and everyone shouted excitedly, as always happens. But this is where things started to get strange. When the piñata broke, instead of candy and peanuts falling out, the first thing that came out was something black. We all went quiet for a second, as if trying to figure out what it was. At first, I thought they were plastic bags or something that got mixed up with the candy. But then, when it hit the ground, I realized they were birds. They were black birds like small crows, and they came fluttering out of the piñata. But the strangest thing was that they were completely still, as if they were dead. There was a moment of total silence. The children, who had been so excited, suddenly became horrified when they saw them. Nobody understood what was going on. Someone approached to see the birds and said they seemed fresh but not alive, as if they had just died. We all started murmuring, asking how it could be possible for those animals to be inside the piñata. But that was not all. While we were still focused on the crows, some people started to notice a strange smell in the air. It was like humidity, but stronger, almost like something rotten. My Aunt Lupe, who has always been very superstitious, began crossing herself and said, "This is not normal. Something very bad is happening here." The children were frightened, and a few of them even started crying. A couple of the adults tried to calm everyone down, saying that maybe some of the teenagers had played a tasteless prank. But who would do something like that? No one in the neighborhood would do anything so cruel, especially not at such a joyful posada. Then, several adults went over to examine the piñata more closely. My cousin Jorge, who has always been the bravest one, picked up a stick and turned over the remains. Inside, there was something else that left us frozen and with more questions than before. Strange little figures made of red thread and small scraps of fabric. They looked like rudimentary dolls, and the weirdest thing was that some had pins stuck in them. Everyone started whispering things like, "This is witchcraft," or "Someone wants to harm us." The atmosphere changed completely. What had started as a cheerful, festive party now felt heavy and negative, as if something evil were present. My aunts began praying out loud while others took the children indoors to calm them down. Someone mentioned that we should burn everything that came out of the piñata, just in case. That night we lit an improvised bonfire in the patio and threw in the birds, the thread dolls, and the remains of the piñata. As they burned, the rotten smell grew more intense, as if something was resisting being destroyed. My aunts kept praying, and some neighbors simply went back to their homes too scared to stay. What disturbs me most is that after that night, several people in the neighborhood started reporting strange things happening to them. For example, my cousin Letty said she dreamed of a dark figure standing in her room, and others said they heard strange noises in their houses like footsteps or knocking on windows. My Aunt Lupe insisted that it was all connected to what came out of the piñata, and that someone wanted to harm us. I do not know what really happened that night, but I cannot stop thinking about the woman from the next neighborhood over, Mrs. Carmen. She has always been very unpleasant, one of those people who seem angry at the world. We have seen her walk through our street on her way to the market, always giving nasty looks, as if she cannot stand to see us getting along and enjoying ourselves at the Posadas. Many people in our neighborhood say that she was the one who did something on purpose, that it bothered her so much to see us happy and united that she decided to harm us, even the children. They say she is rumored to be involved in dark practices, specifically black magic, although nobody says it too loudly because they are also afraid. Either way, we could never prove anything. But since then, everyone in our neighborhood has been more cautious with our parties. We do not just check the piñatas anymore. We also try to keep everything organized and do not let in anybody we do not trust. Hello, my name is Enrique. I am from a small town in Mexico, one of those places where everyone knows each other and where traditions are sacred, especially at Christmas. I have always liked the Posadas because, in addition to the prayers and the villancicos, they end with a party that includes food, ponche, and even a piñata. However, there is one story from a posada several years ago that left a deep mark on me, something that happened that nobody in town has forgotten to this day. I want to tell you about it not because I want to scare you, but because it still makes me wonder what we really experienced. This happened about 5 years ago. It was the last posada before Christmas, the one on the 23rd. That day, as usual, we started with the processions around the town, walking with candles and singing as we asked for posada. Everything seemed normal, with the children laughing and the adults chatting as we made our way through the route. The final stop of the posada was the town chapel, an old structure that is almost always closed because it is not used much anymore, except for a few special masses. The chapel has a large bell up high. In the past, that bell signaled the beginning and the end of the festivities, but for years it had gone unused because its rope was broken and the clapper of the bell was damaged. No one had ever fixed it because, according to the older folks, it was no longer necessary. Some even joked that if it ever rang by itself, it would be a sign that something bad was going to happen. I never took that seriously because you know how rumors can be in small towns. That day we arrived at the chapel with the procession. The candles lit up the entrance, and the children ran excitedly because they knew the piñata and the ponche were coming soon. We entered the courtyard, and that was when everything started to feel strange. I do not know how to explain it, but the atmosphere changed all of a sudden. It got colder than usual, and the air felt heavy. Some of the adults looked at each other as if they sensed it too, but nobody said a word. We simply continued with the prayer, but right when we were finishing the first prayer, something unexpected happened. The bell rang for the first time. It was a strong, dull sound that echoed throughout the chapel. We all fell silent. At first, we thought someone was pulling a prank with a recording or something, because there was no way that bell could ring on its own. A few men went up to check, but they came back down pale, saying there was nobody up there. The rope was still broken, exactly as it had always been, and that started to make us uneasy. We tried to continue praying, but then the bell rang again, this time several quick peals in a row, as if someone were ringing it in desperation. The echo was so powerful it seemed to fill the entire courtyard, like it was coming from everywhere at once. People started whispering among themselves, and some children covered their ears because the noise was deafening. I was standing near the entrance, and I could not take my eyes off the bell. Each time it rang, I felt as if something inside me tightened. Suddenly, the priest who was with us asked us to calm down and continue praying. He said it was a good time to pray for the repose of the souls still roaming the place. That made us even more nervous because nobody had mentioned spirits before. The prayers went on, but every time someone said, "Amen," the bell rang, as if it were answering. I do not know if it was my imagination, but after a while, the prayers started to sound strange, like there was a deeper voice mixed in with ours. The candles began going out on their own, one by one. Someone tried to relight them, but the wind would not allow it. Everything was cast in dim light, and that was when the whispering began. I am not sure who heard it first, but suddenly we were all quiet, staring at the chapel. It sounded as if someone was talking inside, a low, drawn-out voice, but nobody could understand what it was saying. People began leaving the courtyard little by little without a word. That was when the bell gave one last ring, louder than all the others, and went silent. In the hush that followed, someone shouted that the altar was empty. We turned toward the front of the chapel where the nativity scene was, and we realized that the figure of the Niño Dios was missing. It was impossible for anyone to have taken it without us noticing. Visibly shaken, the priest asked us to gather in the center of the courtyard and pray with him. He said what was happening was not a coincidence, that something had come into this place because we had not protected it with sufficient faith. I had never seen him so serious. We prayed more fervently while some of the adults searched for the Niño Dios throughout the chapel. Eventually, they found it on the floor near the entrance, but it was broken. The figure was split in two and looked charred in some places, as though it had passed through fire. Trying to figure out what was happening, a couple of men decided to go upstairs to see what was going on, and what they saw still makes my skin crawl. When they came back down, they were deathly pale, as if they had witnessed something they could not explain. They could hardly speak, but one of them managed to tell us, "There is someone up there, a figure, hunched over, as if pulling on something invisible." At first, we all thought maybe it was a person playing a mean prank or something like that. But then the man added in a trembling voice, "Its hands. They were bleeding, and it was sobbing while it did it." After that, the priest could do nothing more than bless the chapel and send us all to our homes. But a very strange feeling lingered in the air for everyone in town. To this day, I still do not know what happened that night. Was it something paranormal? A message? The only thing I am sure of is that the bell did not ring by chance. Since that year, the Posadas in town have never been the same. Now nobody stops watching the bell, waiting for it not to ring on its own again.